My heart broke as I threw the chopped remains of my father's old chair into the fire. But I had no other choice. It was the only thing keeping my wife and two sons alive. The smoldering oak remains of the handmade furniture didn't provide heat for long, and soon after, the temperature inside the cabin dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. My shivering wife whispered to our two sons, "It'll be okay. Daddy will think of something." But it was clear in her voice she didn't put much faith in those words. My sons didn't seem to believe it either, and I felt like I wasn't their hero anymore. I had failed them. Their prepper dad, who always had a plan B for disaster, had let them down. Let me tell you, there is nothing worse for a man than to watch your family suffer and not be able to do a damn thing about it. Instead, I felt ashamed. Deeply ashamed. The generator was new, barely a year old and still under warranty, but it had failed me and, in turn, I had failed my family. Before I continue, let me introduce myself real quick. My name is James Miller. A couple of years ago, I was still what you'd call a suburban prepper, married with two kids and a garage full of rations. As a kid, I grew up on my father's farm during the Red Scare in the 60s. My dad, God bless his soul, was one of the 404,000 veterans who fought in both World War II and Korea. Harsh but honest. The type of guy they don't seem to make anymore. He was also what you would call a true homesteader or survivalist. Yet he never described himself as such. For him, it was simply common sense. If you want to know what he was like, just imagine a survivalist MacGyver mixed with a bit of Clint Eastwood grit. He was tremendous with his hands, as many men from that generation were, and he designed and built many things on his own, from improvised power generators, like windmills and water wheels to get off the grid, to food gardens and different ways to preserve and store said food, such as dehydrators and root cellars, water wells, and rainwater collection systems for watering and hygiene too. He even made his own crossbow so he could silently hunt down prey in the woods. These projects had a similar theme. They were all made from easy-to-find materials and with basic tools. My dad didn't even have a workshop. But his most ambitious project was a fully self-sufficient log cabin in the mountains, made entirely by himself. A sort of off-the-grid getaway in case the commies invaded and the nukes started dropping. And when my father lay on his deathbed decades later, he grabbed me by the collar, he was still strong as a bull moose, and said, "James, my son, take care of the cabin. Take care of it, not just for your sake, but for your children too. I found peace there, so whenever you need it, you'll find it there too." To this day, his words still move me and drive me to make him proud. Not only did he give me the cabin, but he also handed me his notebook with all of his projects inside. Years before, he tried to get it published, but a greedy publisher ran off with all of his money and his dream to help Americans get more self-reliant. He hoped one day I'd succeed where he had failed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, one day, not long after my father passed, I took my wife and two kids to the cabin. Since it was old school, self-reliant, completely off-grid, I thought it'd be a great experience for my suburban kids. When we left on Saturday morning, the weather report warned of light snow in the area. Heck, I thought, maybe this isn't such a good idea. But the excitement my kids had in the days leading up to the weekend turned out to be contagious. And besides, the cabin had a stove and an ample supply of firewood to keep us warm. But if anything happened, I had some contingency plans in my truck. Everything would be fine, I told myself. So, after a 5-hour drive through light snow, we drove up the dirt road leading to the cabin, when suddenly the snow became fierce. In typical fashion, the weather report was off, way off, and that light snow turned out to be nothing short of a full-blown blizzard. I tried to turn back, but it didn't take long for the truck to get stuck. We had to get out before we were snowed in. Fortunately, we were close to the cabin, so we made a run for it. Then, after 800 yards or so, we spied the cabin when suddenly something caught my eye that made my stomach drop. The firewood supply was gone. A brief investigation showed some cigarette butts around the crime scene. Someone had stolen my wood. Desperate locals, greedy thieves, or who knows, maybe a gun-grabbing Democrat who mistook the firewood for assault rifles. But back then, I wasn't in a joking mood. Luckily, there was a plan B. See, as a prepper, I always had a backup plan, which in this case were a portable generator and an electric space heater I had stashed in my truck, my BOV. In hindsight, a gas generator would have been better, but I was still young. So, after I tucked my family under some blankets in a small room, and threw some newspapers in my dad's old stove to keep them warm, I set out to face the white hell outside and came back, after what felt like an excruciating hour, with the generator and heater. I put the generator on the porch, hooked everything up, and a couple of moments later, the heater buzzed into action. Relieved and exhausted, we fell asleep on our mattress in the smallest room we could heat, when suddenly, in the night, my youngest woke me up. "Dad, I'm freezing." "Then go to sleep next to the heater," I said. "But it's off." It was then I noticed the generator wasn't making any noise. Immediately, I rushed outside and tried to restart it, but to no avail. What the heck was wrong with this thing? Frustrated, I tried to start it again. Then I kicked it. Next, I pled with it. Finally, I begged God. But still, the generator stayed silent. Defeated, I headed back into the cabin and watched as the thermometer dropped and kept dropping. See, I made a mistake. I relied too much on a piece of technology to save our butts. Now, I'll tell you what happened next in just a minute, but I need to rant about this serious issue first. It's something my dad talked a lot about, and something he often criticized me for. Because when I used a freezer to preserve my food, my dad used a root cellar filled with food he dehydrated and/or freeze-dried himself. While I got my power through an expensive power utility company, my dad generated his own electricity for free. And while I got my water, mainly from the mains, which the government could shut down whenever they wanted, my dad collected his own ground and rainwater. All this stuff I used is convenient and easy. But there are also things I can't do without. And the fact that these items are overly complicated means regular Joes, like me, can't get a handle on it when things go south. And most of the time, it's no problem. When a product stops working, you can just take it back to the store to get it repaired, or call an expensive repair guy. Sometimes they'll say this: "I guarantee everyone has heard this before. It's not worth repairing. You're better off buying a new one." And while annoying, it's not a big deal when times are good. We just suck it up and go with the flow, just like the manufacturer intended. But when times are bad, like in my cabin, and our survival literally depends on this equipment, then buying a new one is simply not an option. But this fragility of products and how they're designed to fail wasn't always the problem it is today. Don't you ever get the same feeling as me, that previous generations were just much better with their hands? They could repair everything, sew their own clothes, and build projects with nothing more than a hammer, some nails, and the plans stored in their heads. So, it was with my dad at least, who, as I told you, was part of what they call the greatest generation. They lived through several wars and the Great Depression and gave us the liberty we all enjoy today. And I always felt incompetent when I compared my dad's skills to mine. How he could fix almost anything. Almost. Because even he struggled with what he'd call modern crap. He basically listed 5 problems these modern products have. Complicated. Modern products are often over-engineered, making it impossible for common people like me to repair when things go south. Some companies, like Apple, even use special pentalobe screws, which need a specific, impossible-to-find screwdriver, making it harder for people to open their devices. The more complicated a system is, the easier it breaks. And when a complicated system breaks, it is much harder to fix. Expensive. The projects are made from cheap materials you can find in any corner hardware store. In case of the SHTF, these materials can also be scavenged, and needed tools are basic, so no expensive workshops are needed. My dad believed in giving the common blue-collar hero a fighting chance. Rigid. Manufacturers don't like you tinkering with their products and possibly making them better, because why would you buy their new products if you were able to improve them yourself? Just look at how many devices there are where you can't even replace the battery. Fragile. There are 2 reasons companies make their products flimsy and incapable of dealing with stress. First, because they use weak materials to cut costs. Therefore, while the product works in good conditions, this means a slight change in the environment is often fatal. Unreliable. The second reason is some manufacturers do it deliberately. So, it'll eventually break and force you to buy a new one. This concept is called planned obsolescence, and it's got major tech companies like Apple and Samsung in trouble with the law before. So, there I was in the cabin, sitting on the floor in the dim light with the broken generator in front of me, trying to figure out what was wrong with it. Meanwhile, my family was freezing, and so was I, to be honest. The only thing we could burn was the furniture, old oak chairs, and tables my father had made. We chopped up one chair and threw it into the stove, something which still pains me to this day. But the warmth it gave us only lasted a moment. So instead of burning yet another chair, I went outside and into the shed next to the cabin to look for fewer precious things to burn. This was the old shed my dad used to store his tools and smaller projects. As I dug through them, one of them caught my eye. It was an old improvised generator made from car parts. Surely it wouldn't work, right? It hasn't run in probably 10 years or so and was covered in a thick layer of dust. But it was worth a try. I fueled her up and put some grease on the moving parts, then took her out to the deck. Then I pulled the rope start. Nothing. Second pull. Nothing still. My doubt increased, but I still had hope. Third pull. The generator struggled at first, but eventually, like Frankenstein's monster, it was alive. As soon as I had hooked it up to the space heater's cable, I could hear a magical sound from inside the cabin. Cheering. When I entered, my wife and sons were dancing around the space heater like cavemen who had just discovered fire.